right, excellent. So here we are in our live Q&A session regarding automated chest compression and field ECMO. Joining us here for this live conversation, we have Tom Bouthillet from Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, and Dave Wampler of San Antonio, Texas, and Brent Lyle, our co-host. And you're in Fort Worth, if I recall correctly, yes?
In between Dallas and Fort Worth, so I have to claim them.
Okay, all right.
Dallas, Fort Worth, I'll claim.
DFW, we'll go with that.
Yeah.
All right, so we did have a question come up. I'm going to let Aaron have a chance to re-enter that question. But there was one thing I wanted to bring up, and I don't know if maybe I'm not quite as up on the literature, Dave, but you mentioned the whole issue of, potentially synchronizing the counter shock with the phase of the compression. And the thought that went through my head was the potential for a density difference in the myocardium when it's squished versus relaxed, and if that inhomogeneity of the tissue density may present an issue, which is kind of a technical, nerdy thing, but if we can't be nerdy here, I don't know where we can.
So, it's a great point. I don't know. Nobody's ever been able to do it, right? We know that smaller chests tend to defibrillate better, and when the piston or the band is squishing down on the chest is smaller. I don't know. And we also know that the dual sequential or double sequential, whatever language you want to use, there's also mounting evidence that it's not really the energy selection, it's really the change in vector. And so, again, we're sort of changing the anatomy. We're physically changing the anatomy. So, I don't know. It's just something that I've always thought would be a good idea. And, you get the source of the energy closer to the target, you're going to have, I think it'll be more effective.
Yeah, assuming the energy, the size of the energy bolus is the rate limiting factor. And I'm not sure it is. I think probably these may be relatively minor, uncontrolled variables compared to what I think we're all really trying to shoot for is a well-oxygenated myocardium that's ready to be defibrillated.
Yeah, if we could just get rid of that clot, that would be the best thing.
Yeah, well, in those cases where that was the genesis of arrest, certainly. So we'll have to combine our field ECMO and our field cardiac cath lab technologies, right?
Sounds good.
That sounds like a freight train rather than a motorhome. All right. So let's see what we've got in the question box. There, Aaron has it. I'll bring it up on stage here. Mechanical CPR seems to improve some CPR metric and significantly crew safety. Is there any data or speculation as to why it does not improve outcomes? That was kind of the big thing that people were kind of scratching their heads about when the mechanical CPR studies were published. So Dave, you want to take a shot at kind of summarizing what the gestalt was from the resuscitation research community to explain those findings?
Well, so it's a little bit of a mystery because we think it does great CPR, and if it's doing great CPR, then it should make patients do better. But the reality of it is, this is just one piece of a very long resuscitation thing, right? And if so, you're manually doing great CPR, then we're already mostly there. So that's one part of it. The other part is, again, it's what happens after we get ROSC really also impacts the outcomes. And so how you're pushing on the chest, I think, is less important than that you were pushing on the chest. Again, I think the real clinical benefit to this is when you are having to do chest compressions during transition. So from the floor to the stretcher, the stretcher to the truck, downstairs, however you have to get the patient from where they arrested to the hospital. It's that transition that is really where the value of the mechanical devices are going to come into play.
Yeah, and Stephanie makes, I think, an excellent comment in that, the application times and the choreography, implying the quality of manual chest compressions prior to the introduction of the mechanical chest compression was a largely uncontrolled variable that was pointed out in a number of the journals with the timing of when it was introduced.
Yeah, and so that's, I made the point earlier, learning how to use whatever device you get, don't care, right? As long as you know how to use the device that you have. Training is the important piece, and you can't train on it once and stick it on the truck and expect somebody that does 2 or 3 cardiac arrests per year to be experts at it. You've got to train it much more frequently.
The other thing that occurs to me, Dave, is sometimes there's just so many uncontrolled variables in a case. It's hard to get the signal out of the noise, if you will. And so this is where, at least in my mind, sometimes I tend to look at these problems a little bit more compartmentalized. If we have good science that shows that a higher compression fraction yields better outcomes, then if we have a process design change that gives us a higher compression fraction, then logically you would expect to see that. And I know there are some issues from a methodological standpoint, but this is, I think, part of the thinking of people considering the purchase of these technologies is, maybe in the back of their minds that, maybe in these studies, isn't necessarily the same as my system, but I keep hearing people say compression fraction, minimal pause, minimal pause, minimal pause. And so if I accomplish that, I should be moving the needle in the right direction, and perhaps its limitations with the research study, not enough cases to pick up the smaller amount of change that these interventions might make, an underpowered study. I don't know. What do you think?
So I like you started this out with signal to noise, because what you're doing is you're hitting right on one of the other items that I've been pounding on for a long time, is that cardiac arrest is not a disease, right? It's a symptom. It's the final symptom of really bad disease. You have to be very, very sick for you to stop breathing and for your heart to stop beating. And there are hundreds of causes of patients stopping breathing and no longer moving blood. Many of those are 100% irreversible. Some of those are reversible, right? And so because in EMS, we have this incredibly low threshold to initiate resuscitation, as we should, right? Our job is to try to save these people's lives. We should do CPR on everybody where we think we can make a difference. But just because of the way life is, a lot of those patients were not going to be able to survive, right? CPR does not fix end-stage heart failure. It does not reverse end-stage COPD. Those patients are going to not have a very good outcome. So trying to find the exact right person for CPR, number one, to work with, and number two, for mechanical chest compression devices is very, very hard. And it gets diluted down into this sea of everybody that we try to resuscitate, that it's going to be hard to figure that out until we have a good test to go and figure out who is potentially resuscitatable.
Yeah, early on in my research career, Dave, I was seeking the death-o-meter.
Mm-hmm. Still looking for it, aren't you?
Yeah, I still am. But it was the whole thing of differentiating, clinical versus biological death. Who should I work and who shouldn't I work? Which I believe is still another hugely uncontrolled variable that I think is significantly influenced by organizational culture. Because as I've gone and visited different EMS systems, I find that there's a cultural issue on who the crews choose to work a code on and who they don't choose to work a code on. And that's still seems to be kind of an alchemy. What's your impression of that decision point, Tom?
Well, I think in our system and hopefully most EMS systems, our bias is in favor of initiating resuscitation until the facts of the arrest are known. And there's no doubt that we work too many inappropriate cardiac arrests. There's no excuse for us going to a memory care clinic and them not knowing the patient's code status, but stuff like that happens all the time. And that's definitely a problem. So I think if we want to get the signal out of the noise, I think that's a good way to say it. One of the things that we can do is look at I think this is one of the reasons that we have the Utstein cohort. We can look at our patients that have a witness collapse and bystander CPR and a initial shockable rhythm and say, okay, well, this should be a survivable case. Obviously not if they have left ventricular rupture, but by and large, we think those are the most savable cases. And so statistically over time, if you make a modest improvement to that cohort of patients, you're going to have a lot more long-term survivors. And so because what we're talking about is the disease that is sudden cardiac arrest, which is different than end-stage Parkinson's, different than end-stage COPD, different than heart failure. We're actually talking about young, otherwise healthy people. Maybe they have cardiovascular disease and need a stent, but these are people that we can give the quality adjusted life years back to. And so those are the ones that, in my opinion, it's not that we don't care about our drowning cases or our respiratory cases, but we should be laser focused on sudden cardiac arrest because it is its own disease. And these patients can be saved if our system of care is intact. So those are the ones that I think that we should look at.
Yeah, and this kind of gets to the point that I think it was Stephanie was making, or perhaps it was Jim, but they were talking about risk adjustment. It was Jim, if I am recalling correctly. And he was mentioning the frustration that he's had with his hospital when they were looking presumably at STEMI cases, and there wasn't risk adjustment, or there was some issue with analyzing the data and survivors. And one of the advantages of the big registries is that they, the statisticians will work in risk adjustment to try to equalize for those severe left ventricular dysfunction cases, et cetera, et cetera. And we don't have risk adjustment per se in the CARES data. What we end up doing with the CARES registry is risk adjusting by those presentations. Presumed cardiac etiology, shockable rhythm, witnessed, bystander CPR. And if you run all the permutations on the different types of presenting rhythms, witnessed versus non-witnessed, all those variables. I remember doing that one time, and it was hundreds of permutations for outcomes in that. It isn't just that one column that goes down the center of the Utstein outcome reports from the CARES registry with presumed cardiac, witnessed onset, shockable rhythm, boom, 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 boom. There's hundreds of others, and that's where I guess the intent of risk adjustment is in the registry. Does that line up with your thinking, David?
Yeah, but again, so if we're looking just at coronary issues, then that's going to work great. But there are, again, other causes for patients to go into circulatory arrest, whether it's cardiac or hemostatic or whatever it is, obstructive. And until we can figure out where on that deathometer, what are our thresholds on the deathometer, we're going to get lost in the sea of like Tom mentioned, of us very appropriately resuscitating patients that probably are not resuscitatable until we figure it out, right?
Yeah, and we don't get post-mortem analysis on all the cases to know what the true underlying cause was, at least as much as a post-mortem examination would reveal if there was a clot in the heart or whatever the underlying etiology was. So that kind of undermines the strength of the categorization of patients. But it all kind of ties back to the original question of, why don't we see, the stronger indication of the positive impact of the mechanical CPR in these results, despite all the pieces that suggest it should result in improvement. So the very long answer to the question is there's a lot of uncontrolled variable and noise in the data that we're just not very good at sifting through yet. I'm not seeing any other questions in the queue right now. We're at 30 minutes after the hour, so I'm going to thank everybody for their participation in the session so far. Great conversation in the chat windows. Some good questions come up. Thank you, Dr. Wampler, for your State of the Technology presentation. Masterful job there. We're going to go ahead and start our break now for the next 30 minutes. We'll come back at the top of the hour. So please go say hello to our suppliers in their booths. Hang out in the lounge, grab a sandwich or dinner or a midnight snack, depending on where you happen to be. Thank you so much.